Mr. Jones is an acclaimed author who's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism. His latest nonfiction book, The Last Stand at Khe Sanh, describes and recounts an amazing 77-day battle in 1968 that involved 6,000 U.S. Marines and 30,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. One of the interesting things about the book is looking at, especially with all the recent spate of books about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, is some of the similarities and differences between the battle in Vietnam that he's described in his book and some of the more recent battles in the current wars. So, Mr. Jones?
Thank you. Thanks.
My name is Tom. First of all, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Tom Glenn. I'll be the interlocutor for Gregg. I'll be asking the questions, and toward the end, I'll ask you to ask some questions too. So starting, Gregg, your previous books have been about Teddy Roosevelt, about the Philippines. What led you to write about Vietnam in general and Khe Sanh in particular?
Thanks, Tom. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for coming out today. Thanks to the organizers and sponsors. This is a wonderful event. I was here 2 years ago, absolutely loved it. Judd Ashman, the founder, has done a fantastic job, and it's a pleasure to be with you. There are multiple threads to my answer, Tom, that first of all, I grew up loving military history, American history, Civil War history. Also, my mother, her oldest brother was killed in World War II, and so I grew up with an awareness of that story and what the impact of war on families and the impact that goes on for decades afterward. And finally, I was born in 1959, so Vietnam was the war of my childhood. I was aware of it. My hometown paper, I grew up in a small town in southeast Missouri, but the hometown paper, probably from 1966, 1967 on, had a front page story on the war almost every day. And I was aware of these great events going on. My love of history led me into journalism. I wound up spending 10 years in Asia, and in that time, particularly my second tour, I went to Vietnam as much as I could. And I knew that I wanted to write a book about Vietnam at some point. And 1968 was the year that really attracted me. And then Khe Sanh, to me, was such a dramatic story and also in many ways emblematic of the American war effort in Vietnam.
I understand that you interviewed over 90 men to get this story pulled together. What was it like interviewing veterans from Khe Sanh?
Certainly one striking difference between this book and the last book that I did, which was about Theodore Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War, and then the forgotten Philippine-American War, was I was working strictly in archives and with documents, and in this book, I really wanted to capture the combat experience of young Americans, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, thrust into these extraordinary situations, which Khe Sanh was. And Khe Sanh was sort of a horrific blend of World War I siege warfare and then some of the aspects of the Vietnam War, the jungle warfare that we're more familiar with. And so I really had to talk to as many young men as I could, or men who had survived Khe Sanh in different capacities. And so I started interviewing them and was looking to get different perspectives, men who were at Khe Sanh Combat Base, men who were at the Hill Outposts guarding the approach, helicopter pilots and others. It was an incredibly emotional experience for somebody that is fascinated with the history. Anytime you're able to hear eyewitness testimony, it's a powerful thing. And obviously these events for most of the men were the most significant events they had ever experienced in their lives. And many of the men had lost close friends. Most of the men actually had lost close friends, had experienced extreme conditions and just heartbreaking events, and so they carried these scars with them. So it was a very emotional experience. And on some days when I was doing 4 or 5 or 6 interviews, at the end of the day, I was exhausted by it. So
I should explain to you that for the Vietnamese speakers among you, that I pronounce Khe Sanh like a northerner, because that's the language I studied. Gregg pronounces it like a southerner, Khe Sanh. Tell me about your travels to Vietnam while you were researching the book.
During the book itself, that I really focused, once I began writing it, I just focused on archival and interviews with the survivors. That my trips to Vietnam really were earlier in the 2000s, late 90s and 2000s, and I'd been around the I-Corps region and the northernmost provinces near the DMZ where Khe Sanh was, and so I had been over the terrain at that time, was familiar with it. In a perfect world, I would have been able to go back again with more specific knowledge and to walk some of the places, but in the imperfect world of book writing and publishing deadlines, that I really found myself drawn deeper and deeper into the interviewing process. And then the day came when I realized if I didn't stop interviewing and start writing, that I was going to be later than I already was going to be. And so I wound up really, I wanted to focus on the American experience. I really think that to tell in depth the North Vietnamese experience at Khe Sanh just requires a separate volume. That this book is 125 to 130,000 words, just being largely focused on the American combat experience. I still weave in the North Vietnamese perspective from captured documents, interrogation reports, and things like that, the histories that the NVA wrote as well. But I really wanted to keep the focus and the spotlight on the American combat experience.
Okay. Reading this book, for me, you need to know I spent the better part of 13 years in Vietnam. Reading this book for me was a real emotional roller coaster. What was it like to write this stuff?
It was exactly what you would expect, having experienced a lot of these things. And again, it was, the interviews were powerful. Asking men to relive some horrific experiences, it was a very challenging and delicate exercise, because I was asking them to revisit some of the worst moments of their lives, and I knew that going in, and I was very sensitive to that. Some men didn't want to talk about these things, and I understood that, and I made it clear to men during the interview that they controlled the interview. If there was something they did not want to go into, to just move on. Once I had all this material, and it was a mountain of material, several hundred hours of interviews with the archival, I was meshing the interviews with the archival research, trying to find the narrative threads, the characters that would really carry the story, and looking for powerful stories, but also representative stories, and then building that chapter by chapter. And again, writing about these moments of extreme terror, fear, heartbreak, when men were losing their closest friends, the terror of being hit at night, having North Vietnamese pound your lines with mortars and rocket-propelled grenades, and the men knowing that minutes later that the wire was going to be blown, and North Vietnamese soldiers were going to be pouring through the wire, trying to capture all of their emotion, and then the death, and in some instances the carnage that happened. It was an extremely emotional experience, but I wanted to authentically capture the experience, and I wanted to capture what it felt like, what it smelled like, what it looked like, and what it was like to be there. I really wanted to take a camera into the trenches and into the bunkers, and so I really tried to convey it the way it happened, without devolving into war pornography and excessive or things that I thought were gratuitous scenes of violence. But war is a violent thing, and I wanted readers to be able to understand what these men went through.
Well, you talked to these 90 guys afterwards. How many of them? I have to stop and explain. I use the term post-traumatic stress injury rather than post-traumatic stress disorder, because to me what these guys went through left a wound on them. Several writers have called it a moral wound, others have called it a wound to the soul. So when I talk about post-traumatic stress injury, you'll know what I'm talking about, Greg. How many of these 90 guys suffered from that, and how were they doing?
Almost all of them. Certainly the overwhelming majority. I talk about in the epilogue of the book. I like to try to bring the stories full circle, and I couldn't do that with all the characters that are mentioned in the book, but I do with a number of men, and I tell the story of men who, for them, obviously the trauma began with the experience in Vietnam, the trauma of losing close friends, and in some cases suffering hideous injuries themselves, and then the trauma of coming back home to a country that was torn apart and being spat upon, being called baby killers and other things that a good number of these men experienced, which were really shameful things that these men had to endure after serving their tours in Vietnam. And so a lot of these men simply learned very quickly that they could not talk about these things, that the country, friends, even family members didn't want to hear about it. And so that was incredibly difficult to come back with all this emotional baggage and to really not be able to unburden. And so a lot of men struggled. Most of the men that I interviewed have been through counseling. A good number of them still are going through counseling. As I write in the book, a number of men found a way forward. They found a life partner, or they found close friends. In some cases, it was their close buddy from Vietnam that really allowed them to find their way forward and lean on each other during the roughest times. But in a few instances, men, you'll remember I used the expression, one individual, his compass was shattered and men lost their way. And there are some tragic, sad stories of guys who ultimately could not deal with that and chose to leave this life. But I'm heartened that in the end that there are many remarkable stories. Of one of the great characters in the book was Dennis Mannion, Irish Catholic kid from Connecticut, the son of an FBI agent, who was an artillery forward observer on Hill 861. And Dennis came back from Vietnam, wound up an English literature, high school English literature teacher and football coach, and as a remarkable guy. Talks to hundreds of school children a year about Khe Sanh, keeping alive the memory. And Dennis has a son, his youngest son, just earned his lieutenant's bars, went through OCS in Quantico, and was commissioned a second lieutenant, and so is going through the basic school right now at Quantico. So there are many stories of where also men found their way and have lived wonderfully productive lives. But Khe Sanh has always been with them and will always be with them.
There were so many incidents talked about in the story. You gave us an hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute description of what was going on during the combat. Is there any one incident that stands out in your memory that colors everything that you say in the book?
I really can't pinpoint a certain incident. There are certainly many stories. I mean, all the men whose deaths that I wrote about in detail, I'll remember their stories. The thing that is striking is these were young men. They were brothers, they were sons, they were husbands and fathers, and I mean, the death of a loved one is a difficult thing under any circumstance, but the death of a young person is it's something that obviously their families who are left behind will carry with them forever. And when you're reconstructing the final moments on Earth of someone, it's it's something that I take seriously, and I took great care with, and tried to get the stories right. And I tried to pay tribute to the men as well, and by delivering an authentic history of what they experienced in those final moments, and the comrades who were with them as well. But there are just so many. You know, I remember kids like there was a Marine rifleman, Dwight Thomas Denning, Tommy Denning from Raleigh, North Carolina. Graduated from high school in the summer of '67, the spring of '67, and went in the Marine Corps, and wound up on Hill 861 a few days after the siege began. And Tommy was with a patrol that went off the northwest side of the hill, and this was one of the hills. It's about 3 or 4 miles northwest of Khe Sanh, guarding the approach. And so the North Vietnamese were all along a ridgeline to the west and down into a draw that dropped off the northwest side of the hill. And the patrol came under fire, and Tommy was the rifleman, but he was carrying an M79 grenade launcher that day, and the Marines were pinned down, and they dropped down, took cover, and called in artillery fire, mortar fire. And after the mortar rounds came in, then they got back up and began advancing. And Tommy had a fix on an NVA machine gun, and fired his M79, and he was firing it like a shotgun. And instead of dropping to the ground, Tommy reloaded as he kept walking. He could have sought cover, but he just kept walking straight ahead, and fired, reloaded, and he did that 3 or 4 times until a North Vietnamese round hit him in the head, and Tommy was killed. I'll remember young men like that for always, you know, for as long as I have breath. I think that you know, Tommy died at age 19, and you know, you think about the things that he might have done, and you know, had he had the gift of life. And so there are dozens of men literally like that I really felt honored to be able to try to keep alive their stories, to try to keep alive their memories, and if there's anything this book accomplishes, I hope it's that I hope it will lead readers to try to rediscover a bit of the history of this unpopular war and stories of young men like that.
Well, that raises the question. In the book, I'm struck by the fact that when you are using your own voice, you write without emotion, straightforward, very much like a journalist. When you're using the voices of the men you interviewed, you get all the emotion and all the horror that went with that. But you never deliver a judgment. You don't tell us what you think about the war in Vietnam. Say more about that.
I very consciously, when I began writing this book, I had no interest in refighting the political battles of the war and really diverting into these old debates over why we won or lost, or how we could have won or how we could have won instead of losing. I really wanted to focus on the experiences, the human story of Khe Sanh and the human experiences of these young men. And I have read a lot over the decades about Vietnam. I spent time there, and I obviously had formed opinions in that time. I have no illusions about the kind of war it was. In 1998, when I was a journalist covering Vietnam among many other countries, I spent 3 days in My Lai. It was the 30th anniversary, and one of the American helicopter pilots who had rescued a lot of civilians there was coming back to My Lai, and so I was interested in talking with Vietnamese villagers who experienced that. So, it was a war that I think if you want to refight or trace or get at the roots of my opinion on it is the misstep started in 1945, and when the U.S. was confronted with a choice of did we support the French efforts to reinstitute colonial rule in Vietnam, or did we recognize that there was a nationalist movement that was seeking independence, and indeed some of its leaders were Marxist-Leninists, but at that point perhaps there was a potential to support a nationalist movement and a free Vietnam over a colonial Vietnam. And that series of errors was compounded over the years and decades that followed, culminating with the search and destroy strategies, and I think the war of attrition that General William Westmoreland presided over, which I think was ill-founded, and certainly history has shown us that. I think that General Lewis Sorley's biography of General Westmoreland 2 or 3 years ago, which is a really outstanding biography.
Why don't you wait till the train passes, because I don't think they could hear you.
These trains take a while, so all right, I think the engine's fast. Vietnam was I think the tragedy of Vietnam was our misunderstanding of history. And if we'd understood the centuries-old animus that Vietnam has toward China and not seen it as a part of a monolithic communist effort, but it's easy for us to make those judgments in hindsight because we're free of sort of the Cold War mentality, but certainly I'm aware of the mistakes that were made. I'm aware at the political level, the strategic and tactical level. I'm also quite aware that there were excesses and other things that happened on the ground, and I simply chose to tell an aspect of this war, which was the combat experience of young 18, 19, 20-year-olds and what it was like to be thrust in that situation. It was something that was meaningful to me because I grew up in a small town and in a conservative setting, and that would have been me if I had been born 10 years earlier. Most of the grunts that I interviewed were born in 1948 or 49. I would have been there, and I will always wonder how I would have handled it, and would I have performed with the courage that most of these men did, and what it would have been like, how it would have affected me. So that's the story that I wanted to tell, and I'll leave the politics of the war to other authors.
Well, when I reviewed your book, I ended up by saying men like me who devoted themselves heart and soul to Vietnam have to end up asking the question, was it worth it? And you deliberately avoided answering that question in the book. I concluded you were wise enough to realize we have to answer that for ourselves. Is that fair?
In part, I do agree with that, Tom. I did ask that, and I tell it through the two characters, through Dennis Mannion and Michael O'Hara, in the epilogue.
Yeah.
And I had each of them speak to that question: was it worth it? And Khe Sanh, for those who remember the history, that the siege lasted from January through April. The base was held for another 3 months after that, and then the U.S. sort of quietly slipped away in July, early July of 1968. And so Dennis Mannion, at that point, was still in I Corps, but was closer to the coast and near the DMZ. And when he heard the news that Khe Sanh had been abandoned after all the heartbreak and bloodshed, for Dennis, it was the turning point. He concluded that this war, as it's being run, is no longer worth it. And so it was a profound moment for Dennis. Michael O'Hara, who was a rifleman with a unit, Bravo 126, Bravo 1st Battalion, 26 Marines. 26 Marines was really the main unit at Khe Sanh. Michael really felt that through the brotherhood, through the shared sacrifices and other things that he went through and he experienced at Khe Sanh, that it was worth it. For all of the bad things that followed, the decision to abandon Khe Sanh and how the war ended, that he still felt that that moment to draw the line in the sand and to stand as the men did had been worth it.
Okay. As I say, I worked with both the Army and the Marines in Vietnam for a number of years. And one of the things that I found out was that men in combat are not fighting for patriotism or not fighting for their country. They're not fighting for their God or their religion. They're fighting for the guy next to them. Did you find that same thing?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I really wanted to try to capture was the brotherhood of how, again, young men in combat. And you have to understand one of the fascinating things of really breaking down a Marine rifle company like Kilo 326, which was a company of approximately 150 and 165 men who were defending a hill called 861, one of the approaches to Khe Sanh Combat Base. And in late 67, early 68, the country was coming apart at the seams. We had race riots and anti-war protests. And yet the American melting pot, all that's great about this country, was alive and well in Kilo 326. You had kids from all across the country, white kids, black kids, Hispanic kids, had all come together, had been trained in Paris Island or in San Diego, and they were an efficient killing machine. A Marine Corps rifle company is a pretty awesome thing. But these guys were a team, and it wasn't that everybody always loved one another. There were knuckleheads and guys that that people didn't like and want to spend time with, but there was the love and the brotherhood that was so extraordinary. And you're exactly right. I think men in combat, what I've learned from interviewing a lot of men in combat is that partly men did not want to let their comrade, their brother, down. They didn't want to be embarrassed, and didn't want to leave them in the lurch. And then also was they didn't want their brothers to get hurt. They didn't want something bad to happen to them. So I absolutely believe that and that's certainly my takeaway from interviewing men was they were fighting for the men on their left and the men on the right, and rather than even though some of them were patriotically motivated to go to Vietnam, when it came down to it in a fight, that's what you were fighting for were your brothers.
Okay. If you had it all to do over again, if you were going to do the book now, knowing everything that you know about the experience of writing it, how would you change it? I
would always talk to more men. I would. I could have written 2 or 3 volumes on this, Tom. That editors love to get 150,000 word manuscripts when they've asked for 85,000 or 100 words, and so I actually got it down to 125 before I turned it in. But it was painful, cutting stories out, condensing, leaving out, some of the smaller hill outposts and things that I simply. I could only acknowledge in passing, and that's excruciating, but it's a reality. And if you want to keep a narrative driving forward and powerful, so I always would like to know more. I always would like to have greater wisdom. I always would like to be a more poetic writer, but. Just as the guys who fought at Khe Sanh, they took the hand that they were dealt and sure. Lived with it. I lived with the deadlines and the hand that I was dealt and did the best that I could.
Let me go back to this business of the way this country welcomed back our combatants. More than once, when I got off an airplane in San Francisco, and I was a civilian, I was traveling back with the troops, and people spat on me. How do you react to that? How do you feel about that?
Well, as I noted, and I talk about this in the epilogue, that there was a Bravo 126 Marine by the name of Steve Wiese, who was a rifleman, and Steve experienced 2 of the really most terrible moments. Bravo 126 was involved in a lot of the heartache. They were manning the eastern perimeter wire Khe Sanh combat base, and they had a patrol from Bravo 126 had been ambushed outside the wire on February 25th, 1968, and they lost about 25 men killed, so about half the patrol was killed, and it was really one of the darkest days for the Americans at Khe Sanh, and to compound the tragedy of that was they had to leave virtually all the bodies out there, and that the bodies were there for a month, and the commander of Bravo 126, who's a beautiful human being by the name of Ken Pipes, retired as a lieutenant colonel. Ken could see some of his men through his binoculars, and so this heartache that Bravo 126 and Steve Wiese, who had survived this ambush, and then had survived what was known as the payback assault about a month later, March 30th, when Bravo went out and hit the NVA lines east of the combat base, the NVA that had sprung this ambush on their brothers. And Steve gets back to the U.S., serves out his tour, survives Khe Sanh, and faces that, gets spat on, and coming out at San Diego, protesters screaming and calling him a baby killer. And it was a traumatic thing for him. Steve was one of those guys that just shut down, and he's wrestled with this for decades, and he's had it's been a hard journey for Steve, and that certainly contributed to it and exacerbated it. I think in recent years, over the last decade, I've seen the American reaction to Iraq. I think we've matured as a people to the extent that people understand that you can oppose a war on principled grounds and not denigrate the men and women who are fighting the war. And I certainly think that's a good thing, that whatever your politics and whatever your reasons for taking a stand on a conflict, I just think it's wrong to take it out on the men and women who are fulfilling their duties and putting themselves in harm's way.
Well, in my writing about Vietnam, my writing changed me. It forced me to come to terms with things I didn't want to think about, didn't want to face. But it did change me. Did your writing about Khe Sanh change you?
I think what I said earlier, that, I didn't know the names of men like Dwight Thomas Denning or Jesus Roberto Vasquez or Eugene Ashley Jr., Jonathan Nathaniel Spicer. Those are 4 young men who died at Khe Sanh that I write about, and I'll remember those names forever. I wanted to capture. I think it's important that we understand the obscene nature of war and combat, and I want readers to confront that. I think at times we need to force ourselves to come face to face with uncomfortable truths, and the reality of war is one of those things. And for me, that was a painful but edifying experience as well. Is that as a citizen, it's important to know that and to understand that and to understand what it means and to send men and women into harm's way. And so, I think that I have a better understanding that I'll carry forward of the folly in war at times, the importance of understanding the history, the importance of really knowing what we're getting into, and all of those things. So I think it's more enlightenment rather than, let the train pass, I don't want to overstate. I wasn't at Khe Sanh. I wasn't in combat with these guys, and so I don't want to overplay that. It affected me, but obviously my experience was nothing like what these guys went through. But I'm really glad that I did this book. I'm honored to have told these stories, and I'm glad that I know who some of these men were.
Well, but let me push you on that. Do you think that if the average American citizen understood the ghastliness, the beastliness, the unspeakableness of combat, that we would be so willing to send our young men and women back into combat again?
I think we would be less willing, and that's why I think it's important, again, as uncomfortable as it is at times, to we need to read about war, and we need to understand war, and we need to force ourselves into an area that's beyond our comfort zone in terms of understanding what that means. And it's not all about flags and parades and things like that, but it's also young men losing limbs and losing their lives and really terrible things. And again, the thing that I've been aware of since my own childhood and the experience of my mother's family losing her oldest brother in World War II is that these shattering events remain with families for decades. They will carry these experiences with them for the rest of their lives. And the comrades who were there and the families of these men. And I think as citizens, if we did realize that, and remember that I think that certainly there would be much greater reluctance to take on armed conflicts.
Yeah. What about your next book? Is it going to be another book about war, about Vietnam? You could do something else? What?
I have 2 sort of A-list ideas. I thought I was going back into the 19th century pretty certainly, but I'm less certain now. I have been honored to tell the stories of some Vietnam veterans, and I've been heartened by the reaction of the overwhelming majority of the men, and so I'm contemplating the possibility of another Vietnam book, but I want to put some more thought into it and examine it. I certainly, both the ideas that I'm thinking about will deal with American wars. The question is whether it's 20th century or 19th century. So,
okay. I could go on with this. I love talking to Gregg. He has researched what I lived through, and I can't get enough of it. But it's really your turn. So let me open it up to you. There's a guy here who will bring you the microphone. Give Gregg your questions. Raise your hand, he'll come to you. I take it back. It's a gal, not a guy.
Hi, Gregg.
I
I think I can feel your emotion a lot of times when you're talking, when you start talking about the young men. So I think it did impact you very much. You could feel that in your voice. We could hear it in your voice. But when you looked at the NVA material that you got, one, was that difficult to get? And two, was it written in a slanted to their favor, or was it pretty straightforward?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if you heard the question, but the NVA material, I mean, obviously, if you're dealing with interrogation reports, you know, those were essentially interviews that intelligence officers did with POWs. And those are some fascinating documents because, you know, you get a sense of, you know, a farm kid from near Haiphong or something that, you know, came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and his experience at Khe Sanh and then the tremendous hardship and pounding that the NVA was taking. Now, on the NVA or North Vietnamese authored documents, yeah, there's an element of propaganda in them, on some levels, and I was very careful, very skeptical of those things. My first book was on the communist insurgency in the Philippines, and so I have a little bit of experience in dealing with a Marxist-Leninist organization and the notion that politics and history are inseparable, and so you're justified in skewing history. So I was very careful with those, and on things like casualty figures or troop troop numbers and things that you know, they would exaggerate the number of American casualties, you know, in an order of magnitude of, I don't know, maybe 5, and it, you know, sometimes more. You know, the North Vietnamese force would be up against, you know, an American battalion rather than a company or a platoon and things like that. And so you know, there were those sorts of things, but in terms of movements and certain things, you know, reading it, you could see, I mean, you know, some of these aspects had the ring of truth, and then others, you know, I totally discounted as propaganda. And but I certainly was very, very careful with that and very mindful of it. And I should add that, you know, in dealing with interviews of American participants, I was very careful about understanding of the vagaries of memories over decades, and wherever possible, I checked it against oral histories that have been done contemporaneously. I tried to mesh it with documents. I also tried to check it against other accounts of guys that were there and their recollections, and so I spent a lot of time vetting interviews, and there were a few instances of where didn't ring true, and I didn't use those accounts. And from a very few number of individuals, I'm catching some grief about that. But it was my call to make. If I felt things were not truthful, I was not going to put it in. Sorry? And justifiably so. If I put something in that was that I knew or felt not to be true, then I deserve to be pilloried for that. So, absolutely.
Hi. Can you explain why the battle was fought by Marines instead of regular Army?
I Corps, the northernmost provinces in South Vietnam, was primarily really the bailiwick of the Marine Corps. And Khe Sanh Combat Base was a Marine combat base, and there was a defensive line. Route 9 goes east-west, roughly parallel to the DMZ that separated North and South Vietnam. And so, again, mostly Marines there. There was a U.S. Army Special Forces camp at Long Bay, which was about 5 miles southwest Khe Sanh Combat Base. And the Special Forces were the first Americans at Khe Sanh. It had been an old French fort, and there were French coffee plantations around there. Special Forces had arrived in '62, planted the American flag there, and then the Marines came in a couple of years later and gradually beefed up over time. And the Special Forces, not wanting to have their style of operating crimped by having a bunch of Marines around them, moved down the road and set up a new camp. But it was, you had a small number of Army communications experts and other people like that, some artillery, and then an artillery fire base back about 10 miles back down Route 9. That was an Army fire base that was supporting as well. But it was, that was primarily the Marine territory up in I Corps there. So, and inter-service rivalry. This was amazing teamwork at Khe Sanh, but there was a lot of inter-service rivalry as well. And I catch some of that too. So,
Yeah, I have a question, especially for some of the during your interviews. During the siege, for some of the company commanders and some of the officers up, did the French experience at Dien Bien Phu about a decade earlier weigh on them at all during this situation?
Absolutely. The question was the impact of Dien Bien Phu, which happened in 1954, and President Johnson became obsessed with Dien Bien Phu, and he had a tabletop model of Khe Sanh made by the CIA and brought into the basement situation room at the White House. And Johnson wasn't the only one that was worried about it. The Army, Westmoreland's McVie staff, and also the Marines had examined the possibilities of Khe Sanh being another Dien Bien Phu as early as 1967 because of its somewhat remote nature. But Dien Bien Phu was much more remote than Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh was only about 20 miles or so from the coast. Now, Route 9, the overland route, was cut in the late summer of '67, so Khe Sanh was totally dependent on the air link, and aircraft were getting shot down once the siege began, and so it was a perilous link. But Dien Bien Phu very much was, and then once the word was put out, the correspondents picked up on that storyline. It was kind of overdone and beaten to death by journalists who, my journalist friends here and the former journalists here, who start flogging a story way beyond what it should have been flogged, and but very much Dien Bien Phu was the ghosts of Dien Bien Phu hung over Khe Sanh throughout.
More questions? This gentleman over here.
Hi, Greg.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
Good. Two related things. I don't think it's in the book, but as a matter of military history, how did Khe Sanh affect the course of the war in the sort of the big picture? What was it, a pivotal moment in the course of the war, just another battle? And secondly, like you, it's one of the things I remember from my youth. There's so much publicity about Khe Sanh. How did it have a big impact on the political complexion of the war? Did it have, like the Tet Offensive, or was it
right.
just, or not?
Great questions. The really sort of the larger impact of Khe Sanh. And Khe Sanh, militarily, it was not the decisive conflict that both General Westmoreland and North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap had hoped it would be. They both wanted 1968 to be the decisive year, and Khe Sanh had the potential to be a decisive confrontation. It ultimately wasn't. I tried not consciously in the book to not get too far in the weeds with the whole debate. Was Khe Sanh a ruse that was solely designed by General Giap to detract attention away from the impending Tet Offensive, which was focused on the coastal cities? I happen to believe that Khe Sanh was initially there was the aspect of ruse. Then Tet happened about 10 days later, and then Khe Sanh was going to be the big ultimate set-piece battle that the North Vietnamese were going to use to force the Americans from the war. Because the urban offensive of Tet failed so disastrously for the communist forces, we never saw the big dramatic showdown at Khe Sanh. So politically had a big impact. It dovetailed with the Tet Offensive to demoralize an American public that was being told that the end is in sight. And so suddenly this dramatic specter of an American combat base that seemed to be in danger of falling combined with the Tet Offensive, had a huge political impact, militarily less so.
But I just would add to that in effect, we won the Battle of Khe Sanh in the sense that we held it in the long term. And then we withdrew from it, so the North Vietnamese took it. They claimed it as a victory. That is iconic of the Vietnam War, because after 58,000 people died, we withdrew. Time for one more question.
Thank you very much for the information. I'm going to give it to my buddy who was in the Marines in Vietnam. I think you'll enjoy that. He's just out of the hospital. I did a good reading for you. But one of the follow-ups, after we pulled out of Vietnam in '75, shortly thereafter there was a very large, more than a confrontation between the Chinese and the Vietnamese. It's kind of like the unsung, unknown war. The fact is, in that 1 month or so that they were fighting, as I understand it, the Chinese lost more, had more casualties in that 1 month period than we had in the entire experience we had in Vietnam, that we were there in our presence. I just wonder why that's kind of like lost with the American psyche, why we don't, most Americans don't know about that huge fight they had. And I think that's fodder for some enlightenment of, it wasn't just going back to what you alluded to before, when the end of the World War II happened and we were kind of picking sides and Truman decided to go with the French colonialists. There is that issue with China and Vietnam, and I think that's illustrated 3 or 4 years after we left Vietnam about that horrific battle that they had. But we don't know about that. There's a history story that should be known, I think.
Right. No, and again, I think that's a huge missed opportunity was, our failed reading of history. Our insistence of reading everything through the prism of the unfolding Cold War, right after, at the end of World War II, rather than understanding the centuries-old animus between, and exploiting it, frankly, between the Vietnamese and the Chinese, which could have led us down a very different path in Indochina. But Americans need to embrace the learning of history, not just our history, but also histories of other regions and cultures.
So perhaps the politicians should have read Teddy White's
In Search of History or Thunder Out of China, or yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but I would add to that, you have to remember that Vietnam and China have been at war with each other on and off for over 1,000 years. They have never gotten along well, and Chinese in Vietnam are considered second-class citizens. Vietnamese in China are persecuted. This has been going on for centuries. And as you may know, if you're following the news, it's about to start into a war right now. They're at each other's throats again. So this is nothing new. With that, I have to call this to an end, but I will remind you that right up here on the corner of the podium are little bumper stickers that say, Vietnam, I served. I'm going to take one. I invite you to do the same thing, and I want to thank Gregg for wonderful answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.